The final days of the year are supposed to bring closure. Instead, they sometimes reopen wounds that never healed. As calendars quietly turn toward a new year, the death of Menglong has returned to public attention. Not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a question that refuses to remain buried. At first glance, the story appears simple. A successful artist, a demanding career, a tragic fall. The kind of narrative the public has learned to accept with uncomfortable ease. Another life lost to pressure. Another cautionary tale that fades after a few news cycles. But some deaths do not fade. They linger. They resurface when patterns begin to align. Behind the polished images, the sold-out performances, and the carefully managed public persona, there existed a schedule that did not behave like a normal tour. Movements that defied logistical logic. Distances that ignored the limits of the human body. A pace that allowed no recovery, no pause, no retreat. This was not merely exhaustion. It was erosion. According to records and testimonies that later emerged, the months leading up to the incident followed a rhythm that was not designed for sustainability. Cities were crossed and recrossed. Rest became optional. Financial control tightened. And the individual at the center of it all appeared increasingly isolated from decisions affecting his own life. There were no visible chains. No raised voices caught on camera. No single figure to point to. Only contracts. Numbers. Silence. When systems are built this way, responsibility becomes diffuse. Decisions are fragmented. Each step appears legal. Each demand appears reasonable. And yet, the cumulative effect can be devastating. In moments like these, people often search for meaning beyond spreadsheets and schedules. Some turn to symbolism, others to belief. Some attempt to explain collapse through ancient metaphors and spiritual language. Not because such explanations are proven, but because logic alone feels insufficient to describe what happened. An image circulated quietly among those searching for answers. A creature with the body of something harmless and the lower half of something venomous. A symbol, perhaps, or simply a reflection of how the system appeared to those trapped inside it. Gentle on the surface, lethal beneath. This story does not claim that unseen forces caused a death. It does not accuse. It does not declare certainty. What it does is examine a structure, a machine that does not need malice to destroy, only compliance. Tonight, we are not here to decide what happened in a single moment. We are here to ask something far more unsettling. How far can a human being be pushed before collapse becomes inevitable? And how many others are still moving inside the same machine, unnoticed, simply because their breaking point has not yet arrived? Stay with us. Because this story is not only about one person. It is about a system that never appears on stage. To understand how a system breaks a person, we must first understand how convincingly it protects its surface. To the public, Menglong appeared calm, measured, uncontroversial. He did not project rebellion. He did not challenge authority. He did not invite scandal. His image was carefully maintained as reliable, cooperative, and safe. In the entertainment industry, these traits are often praised. Behind closed doors, they are frequently exploited. Artists who do not resist are easier to schedule, easier to manage, easier to move. Their silence is interpreted as consent. Their endurance is mistaken for capacity. Over time, the line between professional discipline and personal erasure begins to blur. Isolation does not always mean being alone. Sometimes it means being surrounded by people who cannot speak for you. As contracts tightened and obligations multiplied, decision-making slowly migrated away from the individual. Travel routes, rest periods, financial access, and even public communication became externalized. Each element on its own appeared routine. Together, they formed a closed loop of dependency. When control is fragmented across departments, no single hand appears responsible. Schedulers blame contracts. Accountants cite budgets. Managers point to performance commitments. Everyone follows procedure. No one asks whether the body at the center of the system can continue. And the body always pays first. Witnesses later described increasing fatigue, a visible loss of weight, moments of hesitation masked by professionalism. These signs were not alarming enough to trigger intervention. In an industry conditioned to normalize exhaustion, warning signals are often rebranded as dedication. There is an unspoken rule within such systems. If the artist is still standing, the system continues. The pressure to appear composed is relentless. Artists are trained to present stability, regardless of internal collapse. Smiles are maintained. Interviews proceed. Appearances are honored. The audience sees continuity. The system interprets survival as success. What remains invisible is the cost. Behind the stage lights, time ceases to belong to the individual. Sleep becomes fragmented. Meals are rushed or skipped. Recovery is postponed indefinitely. Physical strain accumulates. Mental resilience erodes. Yet none of this violates a contract clause. That is how structural harm operates. Legally, quietly, gradually. In such environments, asking for rest is often perceived as weakness. Pausing becomes risky. Resistance is remembered. Compliance is rewarded with more responsibility. The machine favors those who endure longest, not those who endure safely. This dynamic creates a dangerous illusion that the absence of protest equals consent, that endurance equals wellness. At some point, silence becomes a form of captivity. Observers later noted that communication from the artist grew increasingly limited. Personal expressions were replaced by pre-approved messaging. Financial discussions became opaque. Control over earnings narrowed. When autonomy disappears incrementally, its loss is rarely noticed until it is complete. And once autonomy is gone, escape becomes almost impossible. The individual no longer decides when to stop. The schedule decides. The contract decides. The system decides. What remains is a human being functioning inside parameters designed for output, not preservation. This is the stage at which many artists begin to feel replaceable. Not because they lack talent, but because the structure does not require uniqueness. It requires availability. And availability has a cost. By the time visible cracks appear, the system is already invested. Tours are booked, venues reserved, revenues projected. The human element becomes the variable that must adapt, not the plan. There is no villain standing in the shadows at this stage. Only procedures, expectations, deadlines, and a quiet assumption that the person at the center will continue. Because they always have. Until one day they cannot. The first collapse is rarely public. It happens internally. A moment when the body hesitates. When the mind struggles to keep pace. When the realization emerges that endurance has limits, the system does not acknowledge. And once that realization arrives, the machine does not slow down. It accelerates, because the system does not know how to stop. What happens when a system built on endurance encounters a body that has reached its final limit? There is a difference between a demanding schedule and a destructive one. In the entertainment industry, exhaustion is often normalized. Long hours, tight turnarounds, consecutive appearances across multiple cities. These conditions are frequently framed as the price of success. But what unfolded in the final year of Menglong followed a pattern that went beyond intensity. It was not optimized for performance. It was optimized for depletion. Industry professionals understand the logic of touring. Routes are designed to minimize travel strain. Geographic clusters reduce transit time. Rest days are strategically placed to preserve vocal, physical, and mental capacity. This is not generosity. It is efficiency. What raised concern in this case was the absence of that logic. Cities were crossed and then recrossed. Long-distance jumps replaced regional flow. Recovery windows collapsed into transit hours. What should have been a circuit became a maze. From the outside, it appeared chaotic. From the inside, it felt relentless. Each move carried a cost, not just financial. Physiological. The human body is not designed for constant disruption. Sleep deprivation accumulates. Muscle fatigue compounds. Immune function weakens. Cognitive clarity deteriorates. None of this happens overnight. It unfolds gradually, invisibly, until the margin for error disappears. Yet the schedule continued. Observers noted that performances were still delivered. Appearances were still honored. To the system, this meant everything was functioning. Output remained intact. The absence of cancellation was interpreted as capacity. This is how endurance becomes a liability. When a system measures success only by completion, it ignores sustainability. The body becomes a consumable resource. Each additional demand is justified by the fact that the previous one was met. There is a phrase often used quietly among veteran crews. You rest when the tour ends. But what happens when the tour never truly allows rest? In this case, travel was not merely frequent. It was fragmented. Nights were spent in transit. Mornings began with rehearsals. Even downtime was filled with logistics. Packing, unpacking, moving again. The rhythm of recovery was never established. Over time, the distinction between work and survival blurred. Medical intervention, if present, was reactive rather than preventive. Treatment addresses symptoms. It does not change structure. Fatigue is managed. Pain is muted. The schedule remains. This creates a dangerous illusion that the body is being cared for, when in reality, it is being maintained just enough to continue. Financial control compounded the strain. When an individual does not have direct access to their earnings, autonomy erodes further. Decisions about rest, accommodation, and recovery become constrained by approvals. Even personal expenditures require justification. Independence narrows. In such conditions, stopping becomes almost impossible. Not because the person lacks will, but because the system has removed the mechanisms that allow withdrawal. Every delay affects others, venues, staff, contract, revenue streams. The weight of collective consequence falls on the individual. The pressure to continue becomes moral as much as professional. And so, the schedule tightens. There were no public breakdowns, no visible rebellion, no dramatic refusals. This absence is often misinterpreted as resilience. In reality, it can signal something more fragile. Compliance born from exhaustion is not consent. As the tour progressed, the margin for error vanished. Small disruptions carried disproportionate consequences. A missed connection, a delayed arrival, a moment of physical weakness. Each risk multiplied. At this stage, the system does not slow down to protect the individual. It accelerates to protect itself. The logic is simple. If collapse is possible, finish first. And when the end arrives, it rarely announces itself. There is no single moment that defines the breaking point. It is not dramatic. It is cumulative. A body pushed beyond its ability to compensate. A nervous system stretched past its capacity to adapt. From the outside, the final incident may appear sudden. From the inside, it is often the last step in a long process. What remains afterward is confusion. How could this happen? Why did no one intervene? Who is responsible? But these questions struggle to find answers when harm is distributed across time, departments, and decisions. When responsibility is diluted, accountability disappears. The schedule ends. The system pauses. The machine waits. And the human being at the center is no longer required. When logic fails to explain collapse, where do people turn to make sense of what remains? When systems fail to provide answers, people do not stop asking questions. They simply change the language in which those questions are asked. In the aftermath of collapse, logic often feels insufficient. Schedules explain pressure. Contracts explain control. Financial structures explain dependency. But none of them explain why one person breaks while others continue. None of them address the emotional weight left behind. This is where meaning enters the void. For centuries, human beings have turned to symbols when reality feels too fragmented to understand. Not because symbols are provable, but because they are communicable. They offer shape to chaos. They allow grief to organize itself into narrative. In cases like this, spiritual language begins to circulate. Metaphors surface. Images appear. Not as evidence, but as reflections of collective unease. One such image quietly gained attention. A creature described as harmless on the surface, yet venomous beneath. It resonated not because it was mystical, but because it felt accurate. A system that presents safety while inflicting damage. A structure that rewards obedience while eroding autonomy. This interpretation does not require belief in prophecy. It requires recognition. When people describe systems as predatory, they often mean something precise. That harm is not delivered through aggression, but through routine. Through repetition. Through expectations that appear reasonable in isolation, yet destructive in accumulation. At this stage, questions shift. Not who caused the collapse, but why it was allowed to continue. Why no alarm was triggered. Why endurance was mistaken for stability. Why silence was interpreted as strength. In the absence of clear accountability, spiritual frameworks offer an alternative explanation. They frame suffering as purpose, collapse as sacrifice, death as awakening. These interpretations are not factual conclusions. They are coping mechanisms. They emerge when institutional language fails. Psychologically, this shift is predictable. When systems are too large to confront, individuals seek meaning beyond them. Belief becomes a way to reclaim agency. If suffering can be contextualized, it becomes less arbitrary. This does not make such interpretations true. It makes them necessary for some. What remains critical, however, is recognizing what these narratives obscure. When collapse is reframed as destiny, structure escapes scrutiny. When suffering is spiritualized, responsibility dissolves. The system continues unchanged, comforted by the idea that tragedy was inevitable. That is the danger. Meaning should never replace examination. Because beneath every symbolic explanation lies a measurable reality. Hours without rest. Decisions without consent. Financial constraints without transparency. Expectations without safeguards. These are not metaphysical forces. They are operational choices. And yet, they rarely feel personal to those implementing them. Harm is distributed across processes. Accountability diluted across departments. Each participant operates within acceptable boundaries. No one violates policy. No one breaks rules. This is how structural harm persists. After the collapse, discussions quiet down. Tours end. Contracts expire. Schedules dissolve. The machine pauses only long enough to reset. New names enter. New calendars are drafted. The system moves forward. What lingers is the question no contract addresses. How many people can endure this before another collapse occurs? Because systems built on endurance do not change when one individual falls. They change only when collapse becomes too costly to ignore. Until then, symbolic explanations will continue to circulate. They will comfort. They will warn. They will distract. They will allow grief to coexist with continuity. But they will not stop the machine. The most unsettling realization is this. Nothing about this story is unique. The industry will describe it as tragic. The audience will describe it as shocking. The system will describe it as unfortunate. And then it will proceed as designed. This is not a story about belief versus disbelief. It is a story about thresholds. How far a body can be pushed. How long silence can be mistaken for consent. How many warning signs can be ignored before collapse is no longer an anomaly, but an outcome. When people turn to symbols, they are not abandoning reason. They are responding to its absence. And until structures are examined with the same intensity as symbolism, the conditions that led here will remain intact. Waiting. If collapse is not caused by a single act, but by a system, what would it take to stop it before the next name is added to the list? When the noise fades, what remains is not clarity. It is quiet. After the schedules end and the lights go dark, the system rarely pauses long enough to reflect. There are statements. There are condolences. There are carefully chosen words meant to close the chapter. And then attention moves on. This is how structures survive tragedy. The death of Menglong was not followed by a single revelation that explained everything. There was no document that solved the case. No confession that restructured accountability. No moment when the machine openly acknowledged its role. Instead, there was fragmentation. Each part of the system retained its logic. Contracts remained valid. Schedules remained justifiable. Financial arrangements remained lawful. Every component functioned as designed. And, because each element appeared reasonable on its own, the whole escaped scrutiny. This is the most dangerous form of harm. The kind that does not violate rules. The kind that operates within policy. The kind that leaves no clear culprit. In the absence of accountability, attention shifts. Audiences debate. Commentators speculate. Symbolism fills the gaps. Spiritual language offers closure where institutional language fails. Some describe destiny. Others describe sacrifice. Many describe inevitability. But inevitability is a comforting illusion. Nothing in this story required collapse to occur. It was permitted to occur. It was allowed by normalized exhaustion, by the expectation that endurance equals professionalism, by the assumption that silence means stability, by the belief that if output continues, damage must not be severe. These assumptions are not unique to one industry. They exist wherever performance is valued more than preservation. The unsettling truth is that systems do not change because of morality. They change only when continuation becomes costly. Until then, loss is processed as anomaly, as misfortune, as something tragic but isolated. And yet, patterns do not lie. When similar conditions produce similar outcomes, collapse stops being coincidence. It becomes design, not intentional design, but tolerated design. The machine does not need to be cruel to be lethal. It only needs to be indifferent. Tonight's story does not ask you to believe in hidden forces. It does not ask you to accept spiritual explanations. And it does not ask you to choose sides. It asks something simpler and far more uncomfortable. To look at how systems treat the people inside them. To notice where endurance is praised instead of protected. To recognize when silence is rewarded instead of questioned. Because as long as these structures remain unexamined, nothing truly ends. Names change. Faces change. Timelines reset. The machine waits. And somewhere else, another individual is being scheduled. Another body is being stretched. Another silence is being mistaken for strength. The question is not whether this story will repeat. It is when, and whether the next time, anyone will notice before collapse becomes unavoidable. If this story raised questions for you, stay with us. Because the most important stories are not the ones that shock us once. They are the ones that quietly warn us before it is too late.